Good afternoon. Welcome to this second event of our Price and Prejudice series that we have been holding since last year with the kind support of Annie. Our first episode explored the main reasons of the turbulences on gas markets that occurred last year and the EU response. But we are today in a rather different world, so it's probably time to resume such discussion. And why are we in a different world? After more than 40 years, Europe and Russia are set to end their energy interdependence. As a result of the ongoing war of aggression of Russia and Ukraine, the European Union is planning to sharply reduce Russian gas supplies as of this year by 2/3, according to the Commission's aspirational objectives corresponding to about 100 billion cubic meters, and to phase out gas dependence as of 2027. And this change couldn't be bigger, as it really cuts deep in some of Europe's socio-technical materialities, but also in the consolidated principles and ways of doing things. Notably, the idea that interdependence brings peace and that through trade connectivity of partners such Russia could have been brought within the EU's geoeconomic and normative space, or the idea that energy insecurity is ultimately just a market failure that can be solved through regulation and competition. And all these ideas that underpinned decades of European energy policies seem suddenly called into question even among the staunchest promoters, such as Germany. And yet such a gradual schedule of phase out cannot ignore difficulties and trade-offs. Gas diversification plans are taking place under tight global market conditions, meaning that there is not so much gas around to replace Russian supplies. So if Europe wants more liquefied natural gas from global markets, someone will probably need to have less in the short term, and is organizing this in a context of a commitment to make its economy climate neutral by 2050. And we would like to understand today, among many other things, whether the current events are likely to facilitate or complicate such decarbonization efforts. But beside plans, one should also consider the risk that things don't go according to plans. A gas disconnection from Russia could also take place in an abrupt and unplanned way as a result of spiraling political confrontation. Russia has itself cut supplies to 3 European countries and threatened others to do the same if they do not abide by a new payment scheme imposed by Putin's decree. And the harsh reality right now is that in the very short term, the EU economy is probably not equipped to work without Russian gas supplies, with some internal differences, of course, related to size and final use of gas consumption in different regions and countries of Europe, which may shape in turn different EU countries' preferences and challenges to the search for a unified external action. So this is the broader context within which we would like to discuss today the EU's response, and in particular, the challenge and opportunities with gas diversification plans. I will be introducing our speakers as they take the stage. So first is Georg Zachman, who is the senior fellow at Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank working on European affairs. Georg, what is your assessment of this EU REPowerEU, this plan of phasing out Russian gas supplies presented last week by the European Commission? And what would it take for the EU to succeed in this complex endeavor of ending dependence of Russia? And what do you see as the main barriers to this aim? Please.
Good afternoon. Thanks a lot, Marco, and the EIE for inviting me. And yeah, sorry for this live background that is a bit windy, but it was the best Wi-Fi place available here. So what I would like to look into is, yeah, as Marco questioned, the REPowerEU plan. And in principle, they just use the current crisis as a catalyst for moving faster on what they had planned anyway with the European Green Deal. So, which is good because the ideas of the European Green Deal, phasing out fossil fuels, increasing the share of renewables, building up networks, and so on, is all fine. And and going faster on that will ultimately resolve the problem of dependency on Russia. So in principle, this looks well targeted. Now there's a couple of small items that I find challenging in the REPowerEU, and one bigger item. And the small parts are especially on the demand side. So I don't know where all this demand in the short term for hydrogen, for example, should come from. And also this idea that we can essentially switch away from Russian gas to other energy consumption and keep up our energy consumption relatively high, especially in industrial demand, seems to me a bit over-optimistic, because I don't see Europe being able to meet the same energy prices that it used to have to be competitive on a global energy market. Because I mean, Europe will really become a big energy importer and will have to compete with all other energy imports for prices and not have preferential access to Russian energy anymore. So therefore, I would expect that we will see quite a reshaping of global energy flows globally. So in Europe, less industrial consumption, but also in Europe, kind of more towards the regions where renewables are plentifully available and less in regions where energy is difficult to get. Now, my big issue with the REPowerEU program is essentially that it does not convincingly address the current crisis. So it's not really targeted on the short-term problems of this and next year. And I see kind of four interrelated issues that we have. We have the issue of very high prices that are social dynamite in all of the member states, and I don't see a clear answer that convinces me of how member states should deal with that or how the Commission will deal with that. We have the issue of short-term security, and that's a double issue. On the one hand, I mean, we are subject to blackmail from Russia. On the other hand, kind of being dependent also does not allow us to own powerful strategy, such as imposing tariffs on Russian energy imports, which would help us a lot to reduce the income of Putin and at the same time increase our own terms of trade. So we need to be much better in terms of short-term security of supply. I have a big challenge in terms of solidarity. My big worry is that Europe might risk breaking apart over this crisis because the effects are so heterogeneous, and the solidarity mechanisms proposed are well worded, but we have to see whether they can be tested in practice. And the final issue that I see is that I mean, the Commission just goes along with existing long-established institutions. And these are institutions in which we have invested a lot of time and money, like the energy market, the internal energy market, the emission trading system. And I'm all for it, for keeping those and protecting them. But I'm a bit worried that that kind of the crisis is too big for some of them. And we see the discussions on the market stability reserve, the ETS, and on the electricity market decoupling of some member states. So we are really in a much bigger short-term crisis than I feel the REPowerEU is addressing, which for me looks more in the 2025 perspective than in the 2022-2023 perspective. Now, I would have a couple of solutions, but maybe we can discuss those then later in the session.
Okay, thanks a lot for this overview and assessment of the plan. I would now, yes, of course, there would be an opportunity later on to discuss about potential alternatives. I would call now to intervene Emily Holland, professor at the US Naval War College in Newport, an expert on international security and the politics of energy. And my question is specifically on the role of liquefied natural gas and US liquefied natural gas in replacing Russian gas. Just yesterday, another LNG facility in the US has received a final investment decision. And according to many, the war in Ukraine will indirectly unleash a new wave of new facilities in the US. And what are, in your view, the opportunities, limits, risks do you see associated with an increased reliance of Europe on liquefied natural gas and US liquefied natural gas specifically?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, so the role of US LNG obviously has received significant attention over the past few months of the conflict, and even prior, and during when Europe was having its energy crisis in fall 2021, particularly after sort of the much heralded, flotillas of US LNG were lauded as a savior of European energy. But it's a much more complex picture than that. And a lot of it actually has to do with US domestic politics, which are complicating the picture and will have sort of an outsized effect on global markets as we move forward, both in the short and the medium term. So, I think that probably the most significant piece of news was that in late March, President Biden and Ursula von der Leyen announced the conclusion of a deal that would provide Europe with an additional 15 BCM of US LNG this year. The deal offered quite few details about that, but added that the US would plan to increase exports to possibly 50 BCM by 2030. And this announcement was actually pretty surprising, I think, to many in the US energy industry, who typically view the Biden administration in particularly as quite hostile to their interests. So, 6 months ago, a little over 6 months ago, at the COP26, Biden, basically announced that the US was back on climate change, right? Would be back on as a leader on climate change initiatives. And then all of a sudden, he's basically reversing the call and begging US oil and gas producers to drill. So in this deal, they didn't really announce many details, and they sort of said that a task force would sort of work together to find a way to pursue these goals without undermining climate policies. I'm interested to hear what the other panelists have to say on this, but I'm curious to see how that will actually play out in the future, given those sort of conflicting priorities of the Biden administration. Because it's really important to note that Biden came to office in 2020 as one of the main pillars that he came to office on was addressing climate change. That was one of his main mandates. So this has been a sort of shocking turn of events for both many in the industry and then also to US voters. So the deal also does not sort of address the shipping and infrastructural constraints that make it possible to ship and receive these excess supplies to Europe. So that will also be a challenge, particularly in the near term, in the immediate short term, the next 2 years, about how to overcome those challenges. The details around the negotiations between US exporters and European importers are also pretty unspecified, because these negotiations have to really strike a balance between price and volume risk. So the task force basically called for new contracts to include consideration of Henry Hub spot prices, which implies that EU buyers are going to take on quite a serious degree of price risk for the next 15, 10, or 20 years in a very volatile LNG market. I mean, just 2 years ago, US LNG was basically almost dead in the water, and now it's suddenly being called back to life. And so, I'm assuming, given where we are now, that a strong buying appetite will persist. So EU gas buyers are going to be forced to sort of lock in less competitively priced LNG volume from less economic projects than in maybe more benign market conditions that might not get built. So another issue that was sort of constraining is that US producers have been reluctant to invest in the infrastructure required to produce more LNG, both because of supply chain issues and also the astronomically high costs of raw materials right now. So that's one challenge for them. And then compounding that with the deep animosity between the industry and the Biden administration, this sort of led to some tensions and some skepticism on the part of US industry at first, saying, wait a minute, why are we going to invest in this expensive long-term infrastructure when you could change your mind tomorrow and want to be right back on your climate policies that are hostile to the industry? So given the extremely high prices that we're in right now, we've already overcome some of those initial challenges. And, you know, US gas exporters have already been shifting sales to Europe from Asia, because the prices in Europe are just so attractive and high. So far in 2022, 75% of US LNG exports have gone to Europe. In contrast, 34% in 2021. And yesterday, as you mentioned, Marco, Venture LNG announced plans to construct one of the largest new US LNG plants on the Louisiana coast at an estimated cost of over $13 billion. And so this financing obviously signals quite a renewed appetite for fossil fuels projects, which, you know, over the last several years had become a little bit toxic. And this project will include about 13 tons of LNG per year, or about 15% of total US export capacity. But the timeline for the first cargoes is not until 2024. So again, that does not address sort of the initial crisis that Europe is facing right now. And out of this deal, they already signed a preliminary deal with Germany's RWE to supply some gas to Germany. So that will come online, but again, it's not an immediate fix. And again, there's some sort of secondary issues here, which Marco and I talked about in an op-ed we published together. But, you know, not all is rosy, because Europe is not the only customer for US LNG. Asian customers always want US LNG. And Asian customers actually want long-term LNG supply, whereas Europe views it largely as a transition fuel. So what does that mean for sort of investment and signing deals, you know, as companies sort of look forward to their future profits? There's a few other sort of challenges to the potential savior of US LNG. So as we discussed, you know, Europe pays very high prices for US LNG. And so what this does is it diverts supplies away from other markets. So just today, actually, Pakistan announced that it was considering signing a long-term LNG contract with Russia because of the global gas shortage and because of its basically long-standing energy crisis, because they need to sign the most favorable deal. And so as prices rise and European countries seek alternative LNG supplies and want to divert more US LNG towards Europe, other developing and emerging economies will be pressured to conclude contracts with Russia for discounted prices. This both weakens the Western sanctions regime and also creates new dependencies and alignments, right? So it's a major shift, sort of not just in energy markets, but actually in security and sort of global alignments writ large. So India is another state that's buying additional spot volumes from Russia at very heavily discounted prices. And, you know, it's not just Europe that gets affected by these shifting landscapes in LNG. So, for example, LNG producers in Australia are now finding a sort of stronger demand in East Asian countries as global supply chains adjust to, you know, toxic Russian energy. And as this audience knows, it's much easier to divert, say, oil and coal than LNG, which is more difficult to transport along long distances. So LNG really can't replace Russian gas in Europe, but maybe it could help sort of fill the resulting gap in Asia. But I think sort of the biggest and most worrying trend, and I'm sure we'll discuss it, you know, besides climate change, is really the sort of regressive impact of the scramble to just buy more US LNG, buy more non-Russian LNG, right? We know that energy prices are highly correlated with food prices. There's already a simultaneous food crisis happening now due to the fact that Russia and Ukraine are major grain exporters. So right now, poor countries are facing simultaneous energy and food crises that could be really disastrous. And in the short term, as we don't really have these sort of long-term, we don't have these short-term sort of plans, as Gord mentioned, to alleviate the extremely high prices on the market right now. We're just going to pass that along to poorer states. Not only poorer states, but also to poor people in rich states, right? So the sort of policies that both the US has taken to address high fuel prices and many European countries have taken to address high fuel prices is pretty regressive. It's basically passing costs on to the poorest. So what happens this winter? You know, what happens in the coming months when fuel prices continue to rise? How are governments going to manage that, given that, you know, LNG can shift rapidly? We're seeing already all of these supplies diverted from the US to Europe, but over the long term, over the medium term, how will that play out? Will there be enough to go around? It's creating some interesting dynamics as we are discussing today. We just got news that, you know, we got sort of an announcement that Hungary is demanding, what, 15 to 18 billion to agree to the EU oil ban. So there's sort of tensions already rising, and there's sort of political issues that will arise as consumers in Europe continue to face high prices. So I'll be glad to talk about that later on.
Thanks a lot, Emily. And now I'll turn to Sarah Brown, who is a senior energy and climate analyst at Amber Climate, an energy-focused think tank specialized in the topic of decarbonization of power systems. Sarah, it is often mentioned that to sustain further supply, Europeans need to add gas infrastructure, engage in long-term contracts, but this in turn might jeopardize climate objectives. On the other hand, the EU insists that such plan can actually turbocharge energy savings, renewable energy deployment. Do you think are the current plans for getting rid of Russian gas in alignment with EU climate priorities? And do you think the current crisis is more of a threat or an enabler for Europe's energy transition?
Hi, Marco. Thank you. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a few slides, if that's okay, to talk about this. I'm going to look at it more from a longer term perspective, because as Jörg and Emily have said, on the short term, the REPowerEU is not necessarily doing a lot to address the immediate crisis. So I'm going to look at this from a more long-term perspective on the emissions targets and the climate targets. Okay, so what are the EU's climate targets for a start? You've got the thing that everyone's talking about at the minute under REPowerEU, which is the Fit for 5 policy package and the Green Deal, where they've got to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, alongside the Paris Agreement with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees and the net zero long-term target by 2050. And ultimately, what is definitely required to achieve all of these things is a 100% clean power system by 2035. So how is the response that the EU has just out to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to the energy crisis, how is that aligned with those targets that they've got? So as Jörg mentioned, I do believe that it has heightened the urgency to end fossil fuel dependence and to accelerate the clean transition in Europe. So but they're not particularly putting in measures that are going to do that in the short term. Like we've heard, it's gas diversification mostly in the short term, with 60 BCM coming from alternative places. They're also relying on behaviour change, like people turning their thermostats down by 1 degree. But that's a very short-term measure, not a long-term measure. And how long will that last? Now, the REPowerEU did have 300 billion investment by 2030 in it, in euros, and most of that, 290 billion, is meant to be for clean energy, with only 3% for fossil infrastructure, which sounds like a positive note, but I'll go into the infrastructure part in more detail. And then they raised the renewable energy target from 40% to 45% by 2030, and interestingly, the energy efficiency target has gone up to 13%. So just a massive change from even 9 months ago. Gas is no longer viewed as a transition fuel. It's no longer deemed viable from an economic and energy security perspective. And so what REPowerEU has done in its latest communication out on the 18th of May is really try to reduce gas demand way beyond the actual Russian imports. So they're looking at 310 BCM by 2030, when the Russian imports for last year were around 155 BCM. How are they intending to do this? It's quite an interesting breakdown. There's multiple things in here. They've got 116 BCM by 2030 just from the current Fit for 55 policies. But then they've got this plethora of other measures that they've put in. Now it's very interesting to see that they have upped wind and solar. They have really focused on energy efficiency and energy savings and electrification in industry and residential, which had often been brushed under the carpet or not given as much attention. But I'll speak about this in more details, but there is a lot of focus and reliance on biomethane and renewable hydrogen. which we hadn't seen so much before, and there's good and bad in that area. And then the 60 BCM and gas supply diversification. I'm not sure how they are justifying including that in a way to reduce overall gas consumption. It's not, it's a diversification of gas consumption, but they seem to be counting it in their 310 BCM reduction. So one of the key things that people have been talking about, which may have come as a shock, but has certainly been controversial, is in the REPowerEU, there was 105 terawatt hours more coal power generation in the mix than the current Fit for 55. They're saying they're going to get a saving of 33 BCM of gas from that. But most of the indications we're seeing are that the gas to coal switch started pre-war. It started when the gas prices started skyrocketing mid-2021, and that it would be predominantly a temporary situation due to economics and short-term energy security concerns. We're not seeing, from the data analysis, evidence of any decommissioned coal plants coming back online, just existing power plants running for more hours, which is understandable economically anyway, and also talks of keeping plants that are in reserve already, keeping them in reserve for longer rather than retiring them. We haven't seen any member states apart from Greece confirm a delay to any coal phase-out plans that they had. And even Greece has plans for 19 gigawatts of solar PV by 2030. And on a brighter note, Germany has committed more ambitious targets, 100% renewable energy power by 2035, and has even come out and mentioned a 2030 coal phase-out, saying that it's more important than ever. And they may need to keep coal plants in reserve for longer, but they're not suggesting any real backflip on any coal phase-out goals. And overall, what the REPowerEU, what the European Commission has said, is that the climate impact of rising coal use is outweighed by increased renewable and energy savings, and that climate ambition levels will be reached. Just a quick snapshot of prices, but as we've mentioned, prices are very volatile, and this is literally a snapshot. This could change, this is changing weekly, but these are numbers that I put in just from around a week ago, which do show that gas has been more expensive than coal for producing electricity since mid-2021. And the current forward markets are suggesting that's going to remain the case for hard coal until at least 2024. But then we see gas becoming cheaper, and then we even see it becoming cheaper again in 2026 against lignite. Now, by that stage, the hope is that, with the new plans and the accelerated solar and energy savings, that will reduce demand for all fossil fuels, because this is showing that all fossil fuels are expensive at the moment, and much more expensive than renewables. And so there will be a fall in fossil fuel demand hopefully by the time these prices have switched around. So we won't be seeing a switch back to gas, or gas becoming viable as a transition fuel. A quick snapshot on emissions. This is produced by Can Europe in response to looking at the REPowerEU. Again, they're showing that REPowerEU is actually going to reduce the emissions from fossil fuel use above and beyond what was already in the Fit for 55 package, despite perhaps a growth in coal use that they have projected. And then the most positive note is this accelerated clean electricity deployment that we're seeing, upping the capacity of renewables generation to 16% higher than what's already in Fit for 55. You can see there on the chart on the right-hand side that the purple and the green there, they're solar and wind, and they're going to be like 75% of capacity by 2030, which is definitely propelling us in the right direction for the Clean Power 2035 target. Now, the Clean Power 87% that REPowerEU does include 18% of nuclear, and they have included a delay in nuclear phase out in their gas demand reduction forecast. But overall, what we're seeing is a big jump in the commitment of wind and solar. However, Solar Power Europe have said that 840 gigawatts of solar PV is possible by 2030, whereas REPowerEU has only got 592 gigawatts. If they did the 840 gigawatts, they could reduce gas demand by a further 55 BCM, which would reduce some of those other things that they are currently relying on in their plan. So looking at the gas infrastructure, there's been a lot of talk on this, and Emily was talking about it as well. A lot of analysis has been done to show that that is a very quick fix. But in particular, if REPowerEU are going to reduce gas demand by as much as they say they're going to reduce gas demand by, then this call for massive amounts of new gas import infrastructure, particularly fixed, permanent ones, not just floating facilities, is just simply not required based on multiple pieces of analysis that have come out. So they're only investing 10 billion, I say only, in new fossil infrastructure. Much of that is enhancing existing pipelines and existing capacities. But this increase in LNG import facilities is troublesome on many levels, many that Emily has already mentioned. You're competing with the global market. LNG is not cheap. It can jeopardize other markets who are relying on LNG, other countries. The IEA has said that there's 200 BCM of existing EU LNG import capacity, and that is currently underutilized. So we're not sure where the justification is coming for building permanent additional LNG infrastructure. And it's going to lead to high risks of stranded assets and lock into costly long-term gas supply contracts, because as Emily said, and as we've discussed and people know, the LNG contracts, they're not going to be for 2 years, for 3 years, for 4 years while you want to get through. They're going to be, we've seen discussions between Qatar and Germany and disagreements over whether they want to sign deals for 20 years or not. In 20 years' time, gas demand will have fallen off almost completely for electricity anyway, and therefore you're not going to need these costly and expensive contracts, and they're going to be locked into them. And then a lot of justification for the new gas import infrastructure is also that it's going to be hydrogen ready. There is a fear that that's used a bit as a way to do business as usual from a gas perspective, and that it's highly speculative and not clearly defined. A lot of times hydrogen ready is bandied about without people actually saying, well, what does that really mean? What does it entail? How feasible is it? And questions like that. Looking a little bit at the biomethane and hydrogen, because we have seen quite a lot of reliance put on this by the new REPowerEU, and the hydrogen in particular. There are a lot of questions around that. The importing of 10 million tonnes of hydrogen, be it 6 hydrogen, 4 ammonia, or whatever they're saying, that can be costly, inefficient, and potentially detrimental to the needs of the producing country of that green hydrogen. And also, you'd actually get more savings from a gas demand perspective from directly using the additional renewables, the additional solar and wind for electricity generation, rather than using that predominantly for producing hydrogen, producing green hydrogen. And in the plans in REPower at the moment, most of that new renewable generation in the long term is going to be used for hydrogen generation under the plans. Just to draw a conclusion, on the brighter note, I really do feel that the crisis has accelerated the clean energy transition. It's acted as a catalyst, and people are starting to see that you must move away from fossil fuels, and that renewables and clean solutions are the answer to energy security and climate emergency issues. It's positive that there's 290 billion investment in clean energy solutions. It shows a massive commitment. There's lots of talk about the fact that renewables are clean, cheap, and homegrown. Adding to that energy security piece of it, and taking away the volatility and the exposure to the volatility of global markets. And clear recognition that fossil fuels bring substantial economic, geopolitical, and climate risks. So it does seem to have heightened the urgency and heightened the emergency from an EU perspective. And then finally, the European Commission has said that it's confident that these these climate ambitions will not be threatened by their current strategy and their current policy and plans, despite there being extra coal and despite other things that they've put in that plan. So thank you. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, for this in-depth analysis of the package. I would now give to the speakers the opportunity to react to each other if they want, and also especially to Georg, who took a bit less time than the others, to delve a bit into what could be the let's say a more short-term looking let's say plan, what Europeans should do right now, especially to counter also the possible risk that this supply could just end all of a sudden in an unplanned manner. And I would also invite in the meantime the audience to write their questions in the Q&A. You can see in the bar below there's a Q&A, so you can just type your question and I will pick them up for the speakers. The questions will be visible to the speakers. Thank you. So Georg, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. You're right. Fully guessed my question, or the point that I want to make to think about the short term, because I mean we all in the energy and climate area in the last years were educated to think about optimal long-term plans, about 2050, about 2100, and I mean that's what we used to do. But I think this is not the year for that. We really have to think about this year, because if Putin switches us off, I mean, we will be in a completely different energy world in Europe, and the risk and only the threat about that is huge, and it's fundamental to the way in which the European Union, in which the West, in which NATO functions. So it sounds like hyperbole, but I mean, if you try to think it through, what we are confronted with is that all European countries, and some in particular, are super afraid of Russia switching off the taps. And Putin has already showed to us that he doesn't care about contracts anymore. He switched off 2 countries and a few more companies from gas. And he kind of, we shouldn't believe in those contracts anymore. They are worthless from now on. And we also indicated that the contracts are worthless, because if we kind of reduce Russian imports by 2027 to 0, it would mean that some contracts will have to be broken by then, because we have contracts for these amounts beyond this period in time. So what might very well happen is that in autumn, we are confronted with the request to either stop our military support to Ukraine, to stop our political support to Ukraine, to essentially pressure Ukraine into accepting the military annexation of parts of its sovereign territory. So we will have to endorse the changing of borders in Europe, and is essentially the largest only European country. By military aggression, we would essentially throw away all what international order in Europe stood for the past decades, just in order to be sure that we can heat our homes in winter. And I mean, that is not a choice that I want our policymakers to be confronted with. We might be able to wrap it nicely in kind of, it's good for us, it's good for them, and whatever. But the matter of fact, and what will be clear to every objective observer, is that's what the choice will be. So this will mean not only that kind of we kind of destroy the international order, it will also mean that our Eastern partners will not trust us anymore to defend them. They will essentially be kind of seeking defense elsewhere. So they will work more closely with NATO, with the US, but they will not kind of trust anything that comes from Brussels anymore. And the European Union will have a very, very hard time in keeping up with that. It might also lead the US to put a lot of pressure on us to keep this thing, to kind of stop then gas imports and to not endorse the Ukrainians. So we will be torn apart between our US partners and the Russians. And I mean, it would put the whole kind of concept of the world in which we live under threat if we cannot unwean ourselves from Russian energy import dependency this year. Now, and I mean, kind of, we don't have to hope for kind of the goodwill of Putin. I mean, this guy is engineering a massive starvation catastrophe in Africa, as Emily, I think, also pointed out. I mean, this thing is, we are in a kind of a world of really back to the 19th century or early 20th century, and we should kind of wake up to that. And I think a lot of member states still didn't wake up to that. They still hope that they are back in the good old days where everything could be dealt with, and where essentially in the end of the day a solution could be found, and we could do business as usual and continue to think about our nice long-term plans. So sorry for this rant. Now on the more concrete proposals. I think what the idea that we kind of continuously phase down Russian volumes is not effective, because it kind of keeps Russian money flowing, and we should not want to do that. And also the ultimate aim of keeping to have zero imports from Russia doesn't make sense to me, because Russia is the biggest energy importer. So I think by 2027, if we continue to import a few volumes that we can easily replace from other sources, I have no problem with that. What's the strategic purpose of putting the Russians in the camp of the Chinese and other autocracies? So in the long term, I'm happy to buy with them if I have an architecture that helps me to be secure. In the short term, I want to punish them by reducing their war chest. So I'm a big fan of these tariff ideas, and guess maybe on a price ultimatum, we can discuss about that further. We have written on that, and I think it's a very well thought through proposition. In terms of surviving, but this kind of these sanctions only work also if we can credibly claim that we are independent from Russia, because otherwise we will call our bluff and say I'm not going to pay to accept the lower prices. So again, we need to be independent. So for being independent, a couple of elements. We need to pool the stuff that we have available, and what we have available is a lot of dirty stuff. So we have the coal-fired power plants. We need to bring them back right now. The lignite plants, we need to bring them back right now. All that we have. The nuclear plants, we need to bring electricity to Italy so that the gas-fired power plants stop working as much as possible this year, because every molecule that we save now is in the storage for next winter. We need to do that. And this is all kind of things that politically were not acceptable at the price of 15 euro per megawatt hour, but now we are at a price level of 100 euro per megawatt hour and potentially significantly higher. So we need a pipeline over the Pyrenees. We need to convince the French of that. We need to convince the Poles that they accept electricity imports from Ukraine. We need the Dutch to produce gas in their gas fields despite the micro earthquakes. So heads of state and government should pull next week their heads together essentially and talk to each other what everybody can throw in the hat to survive next winter in terms of things that are outside of the market, things that are regulation that currently prevent us from producing more. Then we need a joint purchasing platform for gas. And the EU has come up with an idea, but the idea is not very concrete and very well thought through. I think currently about a platform that essentially mutualizes the cost of storage filling, so that essentially Germany pays a bit more so that other countries also fill the storages. The idea would here be that then all countries that participate in the scheme are also continuing to participate in the European market, because Germany and other dependent countries will depend on the market. We need the market in order to get the gas in winter. Otherwise, those countries that are sitting on the gas will consume the gas and not let gas flow. The EU proposal of a price cap at 50 in the situation of the crisis is crazy, because then why would France give any gas to Italy in a situation when they only get 50 euro for that? The market needs to continue working, and we need to find tools to mutualize the cost of that. We need joint gas negotiation with Russia. Currently, all our companies that are having contracts with Gazprom are kind of individually picked by Putin, and he knows all the contracts. We know only our contracts, and our governments don't know the contracts of the companies. But we are in a political game. It's completely crazy that there is not the policymakers don't know what is in these super political contracts, and that there is not just one institution at that moment where contracts are not commercial anymore, but purely political, that essentially deals with all that. And Yeah, in the end, we need a tool also to address the distributional effects of the crisis, because they will be massive. We need to make sure that the grandmother in Slovakia is not freezing to death, and that potentially the glass factory in France stops operating in order to make sure that the gas is available. But we also need financial compensation tools to make sure that the poorest in the society don't kind of fall for Putin's propaganda that this is all only a global Western conspiracy to take money out of their pockets, and that there would be an easy way to throw Ukraine under the bus and just get cheap energy again. So I think it's time for strong executive action, and it's time for really kind of focusing all attention on the short term. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Georg. I don't know if other speakers also want to react to each other. So yes, I see Emily. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Georg said is really great. I mean, there's a lot there, and I won't go into detail. I just you know, I'm skeptical that we'll be able to get all that done, unfortunately. Like, you know, what we've witnessed over the past several decades, and I grant you, right, we are in a new era, certainly. Like the level of threat and the understanding of the Russian threat to energy security, I think has changed a lot finally in people's minds. However, like all of that really does require extremely strong executive action, extremely strong coordination, which we've seen can be a real problem within the EU, given that there are completely divergent energy interests among different states. So we're witnessing this a little bit in the discussions on the oil ban right now, that there are just divergent interests. And so this will require burden sharing. You know, richer states like Germany will have to bear the cost for some of the other states that might be hurt in the short term. I think another piece, which also Sarah mentioned before, is behavior change. And you're right, that is a short-term issue, but we need short-term solutions. And I've personally been a bit alarmed, both in Europe and in the US, that there has not been a national discussion on conserving energy. Like, we are in a major energy crisis, and that is not at all part of the conversation in the US. Like, it's just doesn't even figure into it. It's a little bit in Europe, but not enough. There needs to be really strong messaging that there needs to be conservation of energy now so that we can fill storage tanks in the winter when it'll be really serious. And there needs to be strong, cohesive messages amongst the government showing consumers ways to do that that are not super scary or super painful, right? Little things like, you know, turning the thermostat down, mandatory speed limits, car-free weekends, you know, all of these little things that could add up to some pretty significant savings, and sort of talk through that with a really frank conversation. Be like, you know, this is the situation. There is a security risk. The world has changed, and we need to protect our energy security. And so you as citizens will have to bear some of the costs. And you can do that. You can contribute, make it sort of a wartime mentality, because I think also what Georg said, which is not getting sort of enough traction in the press world large, is that we're in a different world right now. We are facing, you know, mass famine as a result of this war. This is going to be changes to global societies all over the world. So putting people into that mindset, saying this is not business as usual, this is not going to go away tomorrow. Right, we are in a new place, so we need to change our behaviors to adjust to what is ultimately a new world in which fuel is going to be more expensive, food is going to be more expensive, and you have an aggressive state on the eastern borders of your country that basically didn't think twice about not only invading the sovereign territory of a European state, but basically committing mass atrocities on the European continent. Right, so framing that as all part of the message of conservation, I think, will be really crucial, given that there's a very serious short-term supply crunch coming up.
I don't know if Sarah has any last thought about this discussion.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I totally agree. I don't think there is currently a unified approach to how we deal with the short-term crisis. There is talk of, gas diversification, and it's coming out of the EU, you know, the European Commission. We haven't seen much action on an actual state level where these things have to be implemented. So REPowerEU did have things like how car-free days, et cetera, but that's just written in a communication that's been sent out on the 18th of May. We don't see anybody stepping up to implement this on a member state level, which has to happen. And there are, like you say, very different situations across the Union, and there will need to be support for, say, the Eastern European states versus the Western European states. But yeah, I totally agree that there has not been this sense of urgency drummed into the public. I think we're seeing public opinion change from a climate perspective, but not with the urgency of which the situation requires.
Thank you. I see that there are some questions that are piling up. I will convey them to the speakers. Perhaps before that, I will pose a couple of questions myself, especially about the current, let's say, upstream outlook. A few days ago, Fatih Birol, the boss of the International Energy Agency, said that in order to minimize the risk for the energy transition while seeking short-term energy security, one should privilege projects with short time to market and payback time, like perhaps a shale gas project, or especially recovery flared or leaked gas. I mean, I guess everyone agrees with the need to limit methane losses, but what about the first part? Do you agree that this type of development, especially at this point in the US upstream, is perhaps due to timing issues less detrimental for the overall climate picture than starting again a wave in conventional extraction that has much longer time frame and paybacks? And then I have a second question. Do you think that in the understanding of investors, is it internalized, the fact that we are just disconnecting from Russia forever? What happens if in a matter of 2 years we have a completely different Russia with all the gas, with all the infrastructure that perhaps wants to flood market, maybe with a different government, a non-particularly threatening one? I'm not very optimistic about that, but I mean, is in the mind of upstream investors, do you think what is going on in Europe is really forever? Because I think that could be also a factor of risk apart from long-term climate plans.
I would have a shot at the first question, and maybe a bit of a provocative answer. I think on the investment side, kind of the payback period and the length of the project is maybe not the most crucial one, because I like flexibility. And so what I would want to have is essentially infrastructure and maybe also upstream, but I have not thought it through whether that's essentially commercially possible, or whether we should make it commercially possible to have such kind of investments possible that are acting mainly as insurance. I mean, I'm coming from the LNG picture, where we had that, where Europe would have fared much better in the current crisis if it had invested in 30 BCM, 50 BCM more regasification capacity. It would have cost a bit of money in the past, but I mean, in the current crisis, it would have paid back greatly. And the problem in the past is that we always constructed infrastructure for 80 to 100% utilization. And that's not security, because that's diversification, but it's not really security. Security is having empty pipelines, empty import infrastructure, and increased potential in upstream. So I mean, the Dutch gas fields are, in a sense, the optimal thing that I could think of, because kind of we didn't want to use them in normal times, and I think it's a good thing because of climate and the earthquake situation. But in bad times, they are sort of the last resort storage that you can tap into. And I kind of just entertaining this thought. I mean, that might be a sensible way. So we burn relatively little, or we put a relatively little carbon budget on the market with that. They are there, but they are just kind of hopefully by a high carbon prices kept under the soil. But in case of a real crisis situation where we really need that and where we have the choice between kind of emitting a few million tons of CO2, but not letting people freeze to death, that seems to be to me a good way. So I would hope that industry, and I think policy is needed because insurance is a very difficult concept for industry to finance, could find a way to invest in such insurance investments rather than investments that are already have a clear footprint of how much CO2 they will release over the course of their existence.
Emily, please.
I'll take a stab a little bit at the second part of your question. So, you know, on the upstream side in the US, there's some difficult calculuses going on. I mean, clearly the latest news about the big investment in Louisiana LNG, that signals that they're sort of beginning to come back to financing these projects in the US. And that's, you know, I guess good in this circumstance. But, you know, US is very volatile, and we can't really have this conversation without discussing US domestic politics. I mean, there is a very significant chance that in a couple of years, there'll be a different administration in the US, which has different priorities. Now, on this issue, they're the same, because clearly if there was a second Trump administration, they're pro energy industry. And they, you know, when he was in office, President Trump was seeking, you know, further exports for US LNG and US energy, and that was very supportive. However, you know, US politics is really volatile. We don't know who would come back. There are significant parts of the Democratic Party that are extremely pro-climate and anti-US industry in terms of hydrocarbons. So that's a factor. And so, you know, industry has to weigh these in when they're making these massive infrastructure investments. Now, financing right now, given the high prices, seems to be pretty easy to get. But I know that, you know, many producers have been quite wary in the US about the long-term viability of upstream investment in this sense. And in terms of sort of, is this divorce from Russian commodities with Europe, is this a permanent divorce, or will we get back together? I don't see how, honestly, at this point, we could, or Europeans could retract and go back to taking Russian energy, given sort of Russia's actions and how they've behaved. But on the other hand, you know, we have to be cynical about the realities of the global economy. And, you know, if prices are the way they are and we cannot reach solutions, then, and European economies are contracting considerably because of energy crisis, we have to be pragmatic, and countries might roll back and decide to, you know, buy discounted prices and discounted volumes of Russian energy. You know, particularly if these political dynamics that happen in the US also happen in Europe. We can't, you know, discount the fact that there are, you know, significant portions and significant places in Europe that right-wing politicians might decide might find success in appeals to certain parts of the European population that are feeling sort of disadvantaged by the current energy crisis and by the potential economic recession that's probably coming to Europe. And that might sort of change political force, and might certainly change political resolve. You know, we're already seeing, obviously, there's still the splinter within the Visegrad group, right? Poland has obviously become like this vanguard of the anti-Russian movement, come to the center of European politics. Hungary is still a stalwart in supporting Russia and therefore supporting their oil politics, but everything could shift pretty easily in Europe, depending on sort of those political dynamics. So it's a fluid situation. I'd say right now, I don't see how things would roll back, but at the same time, you know, the markets can be pretty brutal, and the pain that they can inflict on governments can be pretty brutal, and that could sort of change things. And I think sort of a secondary thing that we have maybe touched on a little bit, but not discussed too much, is just sort of driving Russia into China's arms. I mean, this seems inevitable at this point. We're already seeing increased Chinese investments in Russian projects, and, you know, Russia selling discounted volumes to the Chinese. What are the strategic implications of, you know, forcing Russia to basically become a gas station for China? Where does that sort of leave us in the sort of strategic top-down perspective? And that's something that I know policymakers are thinking through now.
Sarah, you had anything to add to this?
I think I'd probably raise more questions than I actually answer, because I'm just wondering, I'm not being a big investor in fossil fuel industry. It seems, yeah, a really kind of dangerous environment, as Emily said, for them at the moment. Not only have you got the problems going on in the EU, etc. But if the EU and other countries are moving away from fossil fuels at an accelerated rate, and that demand is reducing in, over the next decade, then there's also that question around why would you build loads of new fossil fuel infrastructure? And yes, there's immediate calls for it. But like we've said, the contracts that people are going to enter into to make investments economically viable are not going to be for 2 years, 5 years, not even 5 years. They're going to be longer term than that. And perhaps in the EU, the buyers aren't there for that on a longer term. I don't know. So the question that I've got is that, will the LNG markets be able to be soaked up by other markets outside of the EU? I think that's quite a key question. I don't have the answer to that.
Thanks a lot. And now open the floor to the questions. There are some questions. I mean, some are pretty long, so I'll make them much shorter. One participant asks about the possible role of the EastMed pipeline, another about the general picture of the potential for nuclear to contribute to these energy security concerns. Others ask which regions, countries and regions in the world may be more advantaged in terms of future energy cooperation with Europe. And then we have a question about the common purchase of gas, whether it could work in the short term, replicating what the EU has been doing with the COVID vaccines. I think the issue was already raised by Georg during his remarks, but perhaps we can go in depth with that. So yeah, I think these are the main questions that I see. So whoever wants to react. Yes, Georg.
I mean, if I go first, I can pick the question. So I would choose the nuclear one. Maybe it's also the most difficult one. I think in the short term, kind of using the existing capacities as much as possible and potentially extending what is available in Germany, maybe bringing back some of the existing blocks, might make a contribution. I mean, in terms of volumes, it's non-trivial. If you think about these 3 blocks that went out last year and these 3 blocks that are still running together, they could replace about 40% of Nord Stream, about 20%, sorry, about 20% of Nord Stream 1. So that is quite something. In the long-term new build programs, I understand that many countries are thinking of building them, but the nuclear units that we have been seeing built in Europe were extremely expensive compared to renewables. So I wonder whether from a cost competitiveness point of view, that really makes a lot of sense. So I'm a bit skeptical that, and I would hope that we could still keep a bit of economic rationality on what we are doing here, and that can go both ways. I mean, if the perfect nuclear technology comes there that is safe and has low cost, and I have no problem in saying, okay, that might be an interesting approach, but the current projects that have been deployed are not looking very promising. On the second question that I would like to take a step on is the joint purchasing. So what we are thinking about at the moment as a solution is something that is oriented on the German and Austrian approach. They have what they call strategic storage-based options. It's a relatively complex mechanism, but as I understand it, the idea is essentially that you pay companies to put their own gas in storage and only take out the stored volumes by the end of the winter. unless a crisis happens, and then the government can buy some of these volumes in the winter. And what this does is it allows essentially the government to essentially fill the storages in a time of extremely high uncertainty without kind of killing the market. And I mean, there's so many decisions that if you would kind of do it as a state on your own about how you get the gas there, how do you book the storage? Is it do you nationalize the whole industry? What's the border between private and public? So that I thought that this German and Austrian approach is a relatively nimble way of resolving those issues, and it's really targeted on the short term until we are back to an equilibrium where markets can function. And what I was thinking is to which degree it would be possible to kind of have this not on a national level, but on a European level with a mutualization of costs, so which would mean that in the end, especially those countries that are most dependent would pay a bit more into this scheme, but then can hope that they have access to gas also stored in neighboring countries. And by that, we could resolve a couple of nasty economic problems like free rider issues and moral hazard issues in a way that would allow us to keep solidarity in Europe. So it's not kind of this full scale. We go out in the world and create a European super institution that buys the stuff. I mean, it's much more complicated than the COVID thing. I mean, the COVID thing, you had kind of a product that is virtually cost-free to transport, and the administration is limited, and you know how to distribute it because there's kind of the number of population that in each country. For gas, that's all extremely more complicated. At least that's what we found when we started to look into it.
Thanks, Emily.
Wow, I think Jörg, I hope you're going to write this and get it to Brussels. That sounds great to me. So I want to take a step at the nuclear issue, partially because I'm currently in Paris at the Trek to Trilats right now. So I've been kind of immersed in all things nuclear for the past week. Yeah. So I think I want to frame my remarks by saying that there have been people who have been advocating for nuclear energy as a potential solution to both decarbonization and increasing energy security for quite a while, but that prior to this crisis, that really hasn't gotten much traction as the West sort of turned its back on nuclear, particularly after Fukushima. But the one country that was not doing that was Russia. And Russia became the leader in exporting nuclear power plants to the rest of the world. They currently control 67% of the global reactor market, and they particularly targeted non-nuclear states. So right now they have a sort of flagstone capstone project in Turkey at Akuyu, where they are building, owning, and operating a nuclear power plant for the lifetime of the reactor. And this is like their flagship of a new contractual model that they hope to export to other places. And they're going to also do it in El Daba in Egypt. They've been building power plants in India and Turkey and China and obviously all over the place. And they've been conducting sort of serious nuclear diplomacy and scientific diplomacy throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia for over a decade. And so they've really made strides in that. And not only that, but they've put a lot of investment into nuclear technology, like small reactors and floating reactors, and they're putting all over the Arctic. So they kind of went light years ahead of the West as the West sort of stopped investing in that technology as there wasn't a market for it. Now, however, there's sort of renewed interest in pursuing nuclear as potential solution. But as Jörg said, they're really expensive and they take a long time to build these big plants, like probably a decade, or with more time for negotiations at the beginning to build a large scale reactor. So, that will not help any of the issues that we've been discussing today because they're sort of long-term projects. What would be helpful is sort of small portable reactors, but the West doesn't have very much of those. Like, Russia's going to have 12 or something in the next 10 years. And France has been investing, maybe we'll have 1 in 10 years. So that's not really an option at this moment. However, there is very much renewed interest both on the US side and from certain areas in the EU to sort of reinvigorate their nuclear sector, to sort of make them more competitive on the world markets. But I don't believe that at this point, nuclear is a real answer to any of the issues that we've raised today, except for potentially sort of rolling back and delaying some of the decommissioning of currently available plants. But building new ones probably will not be a solution to Europe's energy security within the next 10 years or so.
Thanks a lot. Any more reactions? Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, I totally agree on the nuclear, particularly on the lead times. There's massive lead times on building a nuclear reactor. It's not going to solve any of the problems either by 2023 or by 2030 even. So yeah, there's the SMRs potentially, but as Emily said, we're nowhere near being at a point where we can install those at any rate that's going to make a difference. I was also going to try and address was there a question about EastMed and Italy's energy plan? And I may not get this right because I'm not an expert on the pipelines, but yes, I imagine that if the gas is coming from Russia, then it will be considered Russian gas and therefore not fit into the diversification criteria. As well in REPowerEU, they've pushed that obviously the national energy and climate plans and recovery and resilience plans, they're getting looked at now across the EU, with the national energy and climate plans having to be revision drafted by June next year, and then final versions by June 24. And I would say that because the REPowerEU targets, etc., have to be implemented into those plans, that there will be some changes afoot amongst all those NECPs and recovery and resilience plans if people are going to get funding for the projects they're interested in.
Thanks a lot. I'll pick up another part of question that I missed, unfortunately, before. It's in Italian, so probably I'll have to translate it for you. It's about the permitting for renewable energy. This is also part of the REPowerEU plan. This is something that in Italy is actually very much discussed, as there are quite a lot of bureaucratic obstacles for the realization of new renewable installations. So what's your assessment about the EU plans in this area, and also the magnitude actually of this problem for the EU's to reach its renewable deployment objectives? Yes, Georg.
The practical challenge will be that something from Brussels on things that are going to be decided in the communes in Italy and on the regional level in Italy is going to be very, very difficult. But so it will take the member states to convince their system to speed it up. And I mean, my take would be these renewables installations, even so we might not like them, I mean, they are not forever. If you kind of chop down a few trees and build a wind turbine, this wind turbine might go after 30 years and be replaced by a better technology than available by then. So let's kind of try not to make these planning stuff completely perfect for eternity. These things are reversible to a significant degree, and we need the stuff now. So I'm sometimes a bit wondering why we are kind of over-engineering these permitting processes for things that are potentially that are practically reversible, and if society decides so, will be reversed.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so the permitting that got a lot of attention prior to the REPower announcement, and then after the REPower announcement, because that was the thing. How do we go from the rhetoric of we need more renewables to the actual delivery and the deployment of it? And there was a big gap between that. And there's a massive variance from state to state about how long things take, from, say, a couple of years for a solar farm in one country to 9 years in another state. So there's this huge diversity. So as Georg says, the EU saying this is what you've got to do on a local level, that's going to take time to filter down, and it's going to vary across the union. In Italy, we've actually heard some quite positive noises coming out of the government around permitting and the recognition that it has caused a huge backlog and a huge bottleneck, and it's a huge problem, and that they want to remove the barriers as quickly as possible, maybe getting some permitting down to a year. I'm getting some projects that are currently in the pipeline up and running by the end of this year. So that's a positive note, but it's going to be extremely varied. And yes, there are concerns around the environmental impact assessments being thrown out of the window in the rush to get renewables built. And that could be a double-edged sword, because it could actually be detrimental to the image of renewables, and be detrimental to the public opinion, which is actually in favour of renewables at the moment. So it's kind of a fine line to tread around that at the moment. But the solar strategy and the permitting in particular did focus a lot on rooftop solar, which can be done relatively quickly, doesn't have quite as many permitting barriers to it. So there are some positives coming out of that, but you can see that some people are looking at that with caution. And then quite interestingly, there are talks that Poland, that has had this H10 rule about how close a wind farm can be built to another building for a long time, and I've always said, we're not changing that for onshore wind. And now there are rumblings that perhaps they're going to lift that rule in the summer. So that could also be good news from a regulatory and a permitting perspective.
Thanks a lot. I'll take just the last question before the conclusion, and I think it's a question for Georg, and it's about whether you could explain the idea of the import levy on Russian gas, and how would actually reduce the revenues for the Russian government.
But it's first point is oil and gas should be treated quite differently, because the dependency is very different. For oil, we think or most people at Bruegel think that the tariff would be ideal, and if we can get it with unanimity, then we would get it as legally as part of the sanctions package, and that would be fine. If Hungary does not agree, then we could do that and a tariff on oil as essentially national Russian oil import taxation. So we can do it as an EU26 tool. So there's ways to have this tariff, and the point there would be that this would shift the balance of the amount of oil that comes into Europe from Russia and from other parts of the world. So the prices would balance out in Europe. Europe would pay a slightly higher price, but would have significant tariff revenues from Russia. Russia would have to underprice substantially its oil on the European market, and they would do so because they cannot easily sell elsewhere, because the logistics cost of bringing the oil elsewhere are very high. Now that's for oil, and it's pretty straightforward, and we can do it essentially tomorrow. For gas, it's a bit more difficult, but because for gas, both the EU is still feeling extremely dependent on Russia, and Russia is also feeling extremely dependent on the European market, because they cannot if they stop producing, they would have to put concrete into their fields in order to stop them, and that will be very costly, because in the long term they might have to reopen that. And it's Russia also would struggle quite a bit. So we have essentially two forces that both don't want this to happen, but then look at each other, and it's a game of chicken who accepts what. Now, what currently happens is Putin reduces the flows every month in order to keep the prices as high as possible, and he increases uncertainty in the market to increase prices further. So we are at prices currently around 100 euro per megawatt hour, while they used to be at 15. So he's making a huge amount of money. So what we are thinking is that we set up a joint negotiator, potentially cancel the old contracts through sanctions, for example, and say, okay, now, because that allows force majeure for the European gas companies that are holding those contracts to get them out of liabilities, and then those the negotiator essentially makes an offer to Putin and says, okay, if you send us very low volumes, you're getting low price. If you send us extremely high volumes, you're getting a low price. If you send us the volumes that we want, then you're getting a bit higher price. Say, if you send us 50 BCM, then we are paying you 50 euros per megawatt hour, which would still be a great bargain for him, but would allow us to essentially be much safer through the getting gas at much fairer terms. So that would be the idea in a nutshell. So it's more about negotiation at that stage, and going to the tariff would be then in a situation when Europe is able to fully replace Russian gas with alternatives that it feels sufficiently confident with.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We are reaching the conclusion. I think we had really a very terrific discussion. We had great insights indeed. And for the conclusion, I will let wrapping up the discussion to Claudia Squeia, who is the head of domestic regulatory analysis and institutional positioning at ENI, our event partner and the supporter of this event. So please, Claudia, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Marco. And I want to thank all the panelists, Emily, Sarah, and Georg, for this lively conversation and debate, which was very interesting to me. And even though we are living crazy moments in which scenarios and policies change almost daily. So yeah, I understand it's very difficult to comment on this ever-changing environment. So thank you so much for the effort. Much has been said already, so I will just make a couple of comments on REPowerEU package. I think the plan the EU Commission published last week is extremely challenging. I think this is something we can all agree on. But challenging doesn't mean impossible. It is challenging in the sense that it will require a radical step change in our capacity of transforming our energy system. The main pillars of the plan are basically renewables, hydrogen, and biomethane. All answers that are the right answers in principle. The problem is that at the moment, the new targets proposed by REPowerEU are top-down targets, policy-driven, written on paper, and must be translated into real projects. We all know there is a big difference between setting targets and delivering them. To transform the targets into successful projects, we will need investors willing to spend their money on the projects, local communities available to host new plants, regulatory frameworks and processes enabling the timely sanctioning of projects, consumers willing to change their habits and to invest in new appliances if needed. And last but not least, I think we will require a scale up in the supply chains that will have to deliver resources, materials, and feedstocks for these new productions. Let's just look at the solar and wind targets. We will have to install roughly 50 gigawatts of new solar capacity and 35 of new wind capacity every year. Let's bear in mind that in the last years, the average European capacity additions have been in the range of 30 to 40 gigawatts per year in total, both solar and wind. So we have to more than double our capacity to authorize, build, and connect to the grid new renewable plants. Of course, the situation we are living in, both in terms of energy price and in terms of need to get rid of Russian supplies, could facilitate this energy transition because it provides a new sense of urgency. But achieving these targets will require all the players involved in the process to converge towards the same direction. From international institutions, national governments, down to the final consumer, I really hope this sense of urgency is felt and shared. Because achieving these targets requires the design of a set of incentives and disincentives in a way that drives the energy players in the right direction. This is something that is much more difficult than setting macro targets, and unfortunately still needs to be done. I am sure the energy industry is ready and willing to proceed along the decarbonization path and to work to achieve more ambitious targets, investing in new technologies and plans. But the public sector, I think, has to fully play its role and has to do it very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for these final remarks. It was indeed a great discussion. This is recorded and will be made available on our on the Istituto for Internazionale social media channels. Thanks a lot. We hope to have you again in possible future events here at IAI, and thanks a lot also to the participants. Thanks. Good afternoon.